Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine put together by the Virginia Institute of Public Policy. Find out more about us and our work at virginiainstitute.org. And, of course, you can always go back and find archive editions of this program on our YouTube channel under the banner Freedom and Prosperity Radio. But don't go there yet. We got a great program kicking it off with Trent England. He's the Executive Vice President at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, but more importantly, the Director of Save Our State's got a new book out called Why We Must Defend the Electoral College. And gosh, every time I turn around, there's another scam or attempt made to just, allow vote by mysterious, unnamed people. We've got Virginia movements to allow without witness, absentee voting. Nothing could go wrong with that. Trent, perfect time for this book. Welcome to the program. How are you doing, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the program.
I guess it goes back to the classic gaslighting. I mean, you tell us we can't do these things and tell us how important it is. Oh, just send us your votes and we'll make sure they get to the right people. I mean, do they expect us to fall for it? And are we falling for it?
You know, the unfortunate thing about vote by mail is that, at least in my experience, you have a lot of rural conservative voters and public officials who do fall for it because, they look around in their small town or their small county and they say, well, we don't have a problem with election integrity here, so, why not save a few bucks and do elections by mail? And they don't realize what a threat this is when you take it statewide and especially in the big cities where you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of ballots moving around through, a handful of post offices, and you've got private mail rooms, places like colleges and apartment buildings, and a lot of good, well-meaning folks just don't understand how dangerous this is.
Well, I bring this up because it feeds into your theme, the Electoral College, and one of the protections, and I think a lot of people think that checks and balances means Nancy Pelosi checks Donald Trump, but really the checks and balances were to check and balance the frothing passions of a mob versus the overall best interests of a community. And nobody likes to think of themselves as that. But the Electoral College was one way where, the big cities didn't get to dominate or the populous states didn't get to dominate. And especially if we're going into this crazy making world of vote by mail, who knows who's voting and more, all the more reason to protect the sanctity, at least of the state's individuality, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Electoral College uses states to contain elections, to keep election administration local, at least at the state level, and usually the states then push that power down to local governments. We don't have, the president is not in charge of presidential elections, which is a really important thing. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of folks on the left who they want, and they're open about this. Elizabeth Warren was campaigning on this last year. They want Washington, D.C. put in charge of all of our elections. They want Nancy Pelosi to be able to write laws that make voter ID illegal, that force vote by mail everywhere, that turn us into this kind of, all trust and no verify election system, which, they claim is a more pure democracy. I think that is very much in doubt. You go back a couple generations ago, and people thought going to the polls and voting in a controlled environment was, we had finally made all this progress to get to a point where elections were really secure and people couldn't be threatened or paid to vote, some particular way. I really think, these people who claim to be progressive seem to be pushing us to regress when it comes to elections. And you're right, the Electoral College protects us somewhat from that. As long as we can protect the Electoral College.
Well, and that's again, it goes back to the state's sovereignty over the electoral process, and not a federal centralized. Now, of course, Trent, I'm sure that the folks like Nancy Pelosi, who have been in Congress since the Truman administration, I think, I could be wrong, somewhere around, but they've been around so long. I'm sure this was a big agenda point during the years, let's say, from 2008 through 2016. Correct?
It is definitely interesting that we don't see quite as much agitation to change the rules when the other side is winning, and that it's how you just look at some of the results from their push to go to vote by mail and same-day registration, and to basically outlaw asking people for identification. When they've done that in states like California, like Oregon and Washington and Colorado, Democrats somehow mysteriously tend to do much better, and you do have these instances of very suspicious election practices in a lot of these states. I grew up in Washington State, and in 2004, the Republican gubernatorial candidate was winning on election night. He won the first recount. But when they recounted everything again, they kept finding more and more ballots. They knew exactly how many they needed to win, and lo and behold, they found just enough. And that's not a good. Even if there wasn't fraud in that election, and I think there was, but even if there wasn't, it's a terrible system because you can't prove that it's secure. You can't prove that it's valid, and so it erodes people's faith in this whole electoral process.
Well, and we see the fruits of this. Story broke, I guess, in the Daily Mail. Why is it all the good American stories seem to come out of the British press, Trent? This fella in California had a whole bunch of, or caught, I guess, saw a packet of ballots mailed to his neighbor, all with different names, all with his neighbor's address on it. As they had all been registered to vote at this woman's address. And, so that's the kind of voter fraud you're talking about, because you can't traffic that if you have to go in person and you have to sign a piece of paper saying I am who is on my ID and I've proved who I am, because we've seen cases in Louisa, right in our flagship area, where a fellow who was a staffer at a senior living facility harvested all the votes of his charges at the senior center and mailed them all in himself. And is now doing time and has lost his voting rights by being convicted of a voter fraud felony. So it's, I guess, part and parcel. It's why we weren't supposed to be a direct democracy anyway. Trent, was to protect us from this need to get as many votes for my cause or for my financial support as I could.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the British press. And we've seen this kind of attitude from the left in Britain, where a lot of them, they had the Brexit vote. They were against Brexit. They love the EU because it's a big, giant regulatory bureaucracy. And they lost that vote. And what did they say? Well, we want another vote, right? I mean, these people are so democratic that their process, their idea of democracy is, we'll just keep holding elections, keep changing the rules, and once we win, then it's over.
Yeah, it's true.
And in a way, it does kind of get to that the founders' skepticism about democracy, right? Because on the one hand, we have to rule by consent, right? I mean, we believe in the dignity of individual human beings, that people have rights, and therefore we should have a government by consent. But we also understand that, as you mentioned before, that the passions of the moment can pervert even a majority view to be something that's unjust. And ultimately, the point of government is upholding justice, not just sort of taking the public will and putting maximum force behind it. That was kind of the idea of the French Revolution. It didn't turn out very well. We're trying to form a government by consent, but ultimately the point is to do justice. And so sometimes democracy is going to conflict with that, and that's why we need all these checks and balances.
Trent England's got a new book out. It's called Why We Must Defend the Electoral College, director of Save Our States. So, Trent, I want you to help me out here because I was approached by a good friend, former Virginia Senator Steve Newman, who, sat down with me. We had a long PowerPoint presentation. A fellow with him made the Republican argument for dissolving the Electoral College. And he called it the conservative message, but it really turned out to be about party building. And it really was based on this idea that if we get rid of the Electoral College, all these red states, all these red counties, I think it's somewhere along the lines of 80 some odd percent of the counties in America vote Republican as a block. And that would grow the political party stronger in those areas, because technically the Electoral College, in their defense of this dissolving of it, it actually weakens the Republican Party because of the big cities dominating these states. Talk about that argument from the right that this will help grow the conservative party brand if we get rid of the Electoral College.
Yeah, so they make this argument. I think that the strongest argument they can make is probably about a state like California. So they say, look, there are millions of Republicans in California. The problem is that there are more Democrats on a percentage basis, and so California goes. Everybody knows California is going to go to the Democrats, and so that means that Republicans don't have a reason to turn out and vote in California. There are a couple of different problems with that argument. One is that Republicans do turn out and vote in California. Just like I'm here in Oklahoma, every county in Oklahoma has gone Republican in presidential elections since 2008. I mean, all 77 Oklahoma counties, right? This is one of the reddest states in the country. Democrats still turn out and vote. Democrats, had a real contender. A lot of people thought in the governor's race last time around here. So,
that was Joe Exotic, right?
He was a libertarian.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. I'm sorry. It was one quick fever pass through Tiger King, and I just. But no, I digress.
Right.
But you're talking about 77 states.
Hot items. But no, both of the major political parties. You go up to Vermont, the Republican Party is active in Vermont. So this idea that the political parties are somehow not active in every state, it's just not true on the ground. And that people aren't turning out and voting even when they know that their party's going to lose a particular election. That's true in House races and Senate races and state legislative races, right? I mean, there are people in Oklahoma who they know that their legislative district's going to go to the Democrat, their congressional district's going to go to the Republican, and that's just part of having elections, and I guess having polling. Is that sometimes we know all this.
Right, or we think we do. Trent, in Virginia per se, so you go to ballotpedia.org and you look at the voting records of all these counties, and there's about 8 counties in Virginia that are blue and the rest are red. There's, I think Montgomery County, Virginia is about the only one that's kind of 50-50. So I guess that's where this feeling comes from, is that, well, how come Virginia Republicans don't do better? But it comes down to, the candidates in a lot of cases. You mentioned the Democrat that nearly won the governor's race in Oklahoma. I'm sure it was more about the candidate than the party.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Democrat was pro-life, right? So that's a big difference based on based on our particular state. But yeah, for people who make that kind of an argument, the problem is if you go to a national winner-take-all system, you actually make that whole issue worse, right? Rather than better, which is the big cities get even more power, and the elections become even more about just where the population density is. And so, I always think it's interesting. I mean, people have a very legitimate frustration. We used to feel that in Washington State because, the Democrats can win Washington State, by just winning Seattle and a few surrounding cities,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole rest of the state's red, and you've got this one blue hole, and it feels like the tail's wagging the dog. But if we didn't have the Electoral College, the country would be like that, right? I mean, Hillary Clinton could have won the 2016 election with her coalition that was based just on really a kind of a handful of big cities around the country, and that would have been enough to win without the Electoral College. So that it makes things so much worse.
Well, let me ask you this, Trent. Let's go the other direction. We just saw our May elections here in Virginia. That's kind of the local town and county and city elections tend to be, although many of them have over the last 15 or 20 years said, wouldn't it be easier if we just held these on the federal election day? But in these cities, we were seeing Republicans winning city council seats, and I'm sure in Republican counties, Democrats can win county board of supervisors seats when you peel them away from the federal election and the big money, big ticket, big media buy, overarching federal elections. Would a better answer to this, especially, in terms of, representative government, federal election day, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, but, local elections can be in May or June, and let your local governments be dictated then, and let November be for the federal elections?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, there's, I think it's a problem sometimes when we have a whole bunch of different election days, but I think having real distinct elections for federal offices and for other offices, I think that's a great idea. I mean, you mentioned elections being more about the individual person, right? With the Oklahoma governor's race or some of these local races in Virginia. And, that's really borne out by the experience in states like New Jersey and Louisiana, where they have their state elections in odd numbered years, or even states like Vermont and New Hampshire, where their legislative districts are so small that even though most everybody's running with a party label and they're running in the regular election, every 2 years or 4 years for their state senates, but because they only have a few thousand constituents, people actually know their state legislators, right? They know who these people are personally, and the party labels just don't matter as much. I think all these conversations about election reform miss some of these really basic things that if it's hard to do, but if we had smaller districts for many offices, and as you say, if we had election days that allowed us to focus more on local government, I think we could make these elections a lot more competitive.
Trent England, Save Our States. You're a man after my own heart. I've pointed out for some time, though, to some controversy, because on the surface it sounds like I advocate for growing government. But the only branch of government, the only part of government that hasn't grown in the last 100 years is the part that actually is supposed to represent the population, which in most places is 3 times as large as it was 100 years ago, and that's the elected representatives. We have the exact same number of Congress people we did 100 years ago. Virginia has the exact same number of delegates and senators in the House as they did 100 years ago, and so we're technically, I guess mathematically, a third less well represented.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we have one branch of government, the federal level, that is supposed to represent us. We know that because they're called representatives, right? It's not a mystery here, and that's exactly right. I mean, we have been less and less and less represented in the House of Representatives as population has grown and the House hasn't, and House members have basically become like senators, right? They're remote from people. It costs a lot of money to win their elections. You got to have a lot of connections. And so once you do, you stay there as long as you can, and the power of incumbency makes that possible for most House members, and just exacerbates that problem where people just really aren't represented in Congress anymore, at least not the way that the founders thought about it.
Well, let me ask you this, and this is the reason I brought this up. Is that in the Electoral College, your book, to save the Electoral College, the number of electors each state has is based on congressional district plus one for each senator. So if we had real good balance in our representation, we would have a larger electoral college, or at least by membership, wouldn't we?
Yeah, we would, and that would, for people who grouse about the fact that, Wyoming has a lot more, Wyoming voters have more of a say than California voters. If we allowed the House to grow, that effect would be reduced a little bit, not completely because of the Senate, but no, that's right. I think the concerns about faithless electors would be reduced. That's right. I mean, we would have a lot more votes in the Electoral College, and you'd still have to have a majority to win. But I think some of these other little problems that people have with the system would be ameliorated a little bit.
What about the states that apportion? I think there's only a couple that apportion their electors by the congressional district. So, for example, in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have still carried Virginia, but she didn't get all 13 of our districts. She carried the statewide popular vote, so she gets the 2 Senate delegates to the Electoral College, but she didn't carry all of the congressional districts. Out of the 11, I think she carried only 5, and Donald Trump carried 6. So he would have gotten 6 electors out of Virginia instead of 0.
Yeah. So Maine and Nebraska have used that system for quite a while. And it works really well for those states because they, for a couple of reasons. One, they're fairly small, and they're not especially gerrymandered. And they also tend to, Republicans tend to always win Nebraska, and Democrats tend to always win Maine in presidential races. And so basically what each state legislature did was say, we're going to put one of our congressional districts in play, because they have, effectively Nebraska has one district that Democrats can win. Maine has one district Republicans can win. And by doing that, they're encouraging their state to get more attention in presidential contests, but they're not risking the Republicans who control Nebraska aren't risking very much by doing that. When you get to a larger state like Virginia, obviously, at this point, the Democrats would be risking, 6 electoral votes. And if you went back to when Republicans were in control of the legislature there, they would have been risking, probably 4 or 5, maybe 3 or 4 electoral votes at the time. So there's a big incentive for larger states to just say, hey, we're going to be winner take all. We're going to maximize the political power of our state. And there's also, I've toyed with the idea of trying to get states to get a big block of states to go to the congressional district model, because in some ways that would make things feel a lot more competitive. The problem is that with gerrymandering, you actually reduce the number of Americans who would be in a competitive situation.
Well, and then we go back to the size of the House, and then so the gerrymandering almost becomes necessary when you're trying to stretch a district to get 800,000 or 900,000 people in it at a time. Trent,
that's exactly right. If we had a larger House of Representatives, gerrymandering would become sort of irrelevant.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your. So the book is on the bookstore shelves now?
Yes, it is.
And
Why We Must Defend the Electoral College.
And then SaveOurStates.org as well. They can get it there?
They can find a link to it on our resource page at SaveOurStates.com. That's right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just automatically defer to org.
Either one works.
Well, Trent, thank you so much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Sounds good. My pleasure.